Welcome to 56-Bit Cloud Cafe, your go-to destination for all tech topics in the cloud. I'm Athir Zalat.
And I'm Patrick Camilleri. And together we'll be addressing various cloud topics.
Hello everyone and welcome back. Today we are diving into Amazon EKS, Amazon's Elastic Kubernetes service. Get ready to learn the basics, explore the architecture, and discover why Amazon EKS is a game changer for container orchestration in the cloud. So let's start. Containers are almost everything we hear about recently for future-proof deployments. What is Amazon EKS and how does it differ from other container orchestration services?
Right, so that question is obviously quite loaded. There is a lot of information there, but I will try to keep it as brief as possible. So Amazon EKS, or Elastic Kubernetes Service, is a managed Kubernetes service on AWS. It's basically Kubernetes, the same Kubernetes that you would use in any other cloud or in any other on-premise environment, but it is managed by AWS. Now, it's important to understand what Kubernetes and even what containers are before delving into EKS itself. So think of containers as these boxes, these packages, which contain your software. So your software runs inside these boxes, but the beauty of containers is that these boxes are all standard in size, standard in format. So just like a container ship has containers which are of a standard size, because if they weren't of a standard size, you would be losing a lot of space on a container ship. So if you make these containers the same size, you can stack them together and they fit perfectly and efficiently on the container. The same concept applies to containers in software development. Your software runs inside these containers, and no matter where those boxes, these containers run, whether they run on EC2, whether they run on Azure Cloud or on-premise, they will run in exactly the same way. And that is the advantage of containers. It's why they have become really, really popular in the last 10 years or so. In the last 5 years, they've really exploded in usage. So containerization means getting your software into these boxes, into this container format. The most popular container format is Docker. So that is one element, and you can do this without an orchestration service. But once you start adding containers, and companies like Google and the big guys, they run billions of containers, they need orchestration services to ensure that these containers run in an efficient way, in a highly available, secure way. And these orchestration services allow us, think of them actually like the master, the main person in an orchestra, right? You have an orchestra with multiple people playing different instruments, and then you've got the conductor of the orchestra, and that conductor is basically the orchestration service, making sure that those containers come up and down as per your rules. There are different orchestration services like EKS and on Amazon and many others. Kubernetes is one of them. Kubernetes was developed by Google. Eventually it was open source. Today it is used throughout the IT industry. It's a really good skill set to have, to know how to manage a Kubernetes cluster. And what Amazon EKS does is it manages that Kubernetes cluster for you. It allows you to remove the focus on bringing up the Kubernetes cluster itself, because it can be a bit tricky, can be a bit difficult to do so in a proper way. And that focus then shifts to the software inside those containers. So you don't have to worry about the Kubernetes cluster itself, but rather worry about what you're putting in that cluster, in those containers.
Okay, so based on what you said before, it definitely sounds like a winner compared to others. Can you explain the key components of Amazon EKS architecture?
So as we explained before, those containers need to be handled in an efficient way. They need to be scheduled, meaning they need to be brought up in the right place, right? They need to be placed onto specific servers on different servers in different data centers. They need to be scaled, so from 10 containers you might have a lot of traffic and you need 30 containers or 50 containers. And there needs to be communication between the containers as well as between Kubernetes, the orchestration service, and the containers themselves. So all this scheduling, scaling, placement, and communication, there is software there, and that software is the orchestration service, Kubernetes being one of them. So Kubernetes has a control plane. That means there is a piece of software which is this conductor of the orchestra. We call that the control plane. And that's what EKS gives you. It gives you a highly available, highly scalable control plane so that you don't have to worry about that part. The other part of Kubernetes in general includes what we call worker nodes. So these worker nodes are servers that communicate with the control plane, and these servers run the actual containers themselves. So usually the containers do not run on the control plane, but rather run on the worker nodes. EKS does not create worker nodes. It's a separate, the worker nodes are a separate service, can be on EC2, can be on what is called Fargate, which is a serverless version of EC2. These containers run on these worker nodes, and ultimately they communicate with the control plane, which EKS handles.
It's such a highly technical service which brings questions to its integratability. How does Amazon EKS integrate with other AWS services, and what are the benefits of this integration?
One of the big benefits of EKS, apart from the fact that you are running normal Kubernetes, which you would, if you know how to run Kubernetes, then you would know how to run EKS. But another big benefit of EKS is the fact that it very quickly and easily integrates with other AWS services. And this is really important because AWS gives a lot of services, produces a lot of good, highly reliable and scalable services that you can use very easily from EKS. So we're talking here about, for example, Amazon ECR, Elastic Container Registry, which basically means that this is where the actual software inside those containers, the images of that software, this is where we store them. You can store them in other third-party registries, but ECR is a very good option because it integrates really easily with EKS. Another integration would be with Elastic Load Balancing, ELB. This is a highly used service in AWS which allows traffic to be distributed onto multiple nodes, onto multiple containers. So if you have 20 containers running the same software, you can have a piece of the traffic being served by the first container, another piece being served by the second container, etc. So this is called load balancing, and Elastic Load Balancing is the AWS managed version of that. And that integration between ELB and EKS, and the Kubernetes inside EKS, is really helpful if it's done quickly, so you don't have to worry too much about it. There is also good integration with IAM, that is the permissions, the authorization and authentication part of AWS. So everything revolves around permissions and security in AWS. IAM is a very key concept there, a key service there, and EKS integrates quite easily with IAM. There are other tight integrations as well with CloudWatch, with the networking elements of what we call the VPC of AWS. So all these things, all this tight integration really helps you get going quickly with Kubernetes.
Learning all that, we can easily say thanks to AWS that we have such an advanced technology being a managed service as part of their offering. Now, what are the main advantages and challenges of using Amazon EKS compared to self-managed Kubernetes clusters?
We've already mentioned this a bit before, but to summarize, advantages of EKS include The biggest advantage is probably reduced complexity. Kubernetes can be hard to do it right. Bringing up a Kubernetes cluster, it's not too hard, but then as you start scaling, there is an element of specialization there that you need to learn and upskill yourself in. And EKS tends to reduce that level of knowledge required to run a properly scalable, highly available and secure Kubernetes environment. So that's definitely number one, reduced complexity, as well as those integrations with other AWS services, which really reduce complexity and speed up ultimately your ability to run software inside Kubernetes. It allows fast deployments because it's very easy to connect to it, very easy to connect to it from services like GitHub and GitLab and AWS's own CI/CD services. Scaling of the control plane and scaling of those worker nodes is super easy with EKS. And all this reduction in complexity and speeding up your workflow basically allows you to focus more on what really matters, which is the software running inside those containers. Which, by the way, in Kubernetes, we call them pods. Are there challenges to EKS? Definitely. Like every technology out there, there are pros and cons. EKS, in general, is very advantageous using it, but obviously there are some disadvantages. One of the biggest one is the fact that you reduce your ability to control the underlying stuff, right? So the whole point of having a managed service is that you don't worry about the underlying infrastructure. Now, this reduces your ability to change that underlying infrastructure and tweak it as you wish. So that does, if you get to that point where you need to granularly control the underlying Kubernetes, that might be difficult with EKS, although there are ways of going a little bit around that, but you will never have the same level of control as having Kubernetes in your own, on EC2, for example, or in your own on-premise environment. So that's probably the biggest challenge, which does not affect most people. Most people don't care about that. Kubernetes is fantastic as it is, and most people will make use of Kubernetes as it is without any tweaking. So it's not a challenge for everyone, but as you grow, it might become a challenge. There used to be also a challenge when it came to using Kubernetes on-premise with Kubernetes in AWS using EKS. This has reduced a lot because now we have EKS on-premise. We can actually get AWS outposts, which basically brings an AWS server into your on-premise environment. So it bridges the gap between the cloud, the public cloud, and on-premise, what we call hybrid cloud. So this challenge has reduced a lot now. Ultimately, though, it is always a balance between those pros and cons.
A while ago, we mentioned that being future-proof in terms of deployment. That sure applies to other areas. How does Amazon EKS handle scalability and high availability of containerized applications?
As we said, yes, one of the big advantages is scalability of using EKS. Kubernetes is very well placed to be scalable, but you need to do the configuration in the right way, and EKS takes a lot of that configuration out of your hands, which is good, right? It reduces complexity. It can scale your worker nodes, those nodes which run the containers. It can scale them very easily, either on EC2 or using Fargate, which completely takes that out of the equation. That complexity is removed using Fargate. So scaling is made much, much easier with EKS, as well as obviously integration with load balancers and other services which help even more on this front. High availability is also important. Your worker nodes should be in different availability zones or even different regions, which allow you to have a highly available environment. But those control nodes, the servers running the main Kubernetes software, also need to be in a highly available format, in a cluster format over 2 or more availability zones. And EKS gives you this out of the box. You actually cannot change this. You will have 3 servers as a minimum in 3 different availability zones whenever creating an EKS cluster.
And by now, we've reached the end of our episode. Thanks for joining us on this journey into Amazon EKS. Stay tuned for our next episode, where we will dive into the exciting process of deploying applications on Amazon EKS. Until then, happy cloud computing! If you have questions, suggestions, or want to share your feedback, connect with us on social media.
Also, don't forget to subscribe to our podcast and to leave us a review to help others find their way to the Cloud Cafe.